Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for your interest in the results of my research, and I would particularly like to welcome any of the farmers who took part in the study and hope that you find the presentation tonight of some benefit to your young stock rearing. The driving force behind my research were the results that came out of a previous study conducted by the Royal Veterinary College by Dr. Jessica Cook, who many of you will know better as Jessica Brickell, and Professor Claire Wathers. And this study investigated mortality and morbidity of dairy heifers on farms in southeast England and recorded fertility measures and longevity in these heifers up to third lactation. An average cost of rearing heifers that is regularly quoted is £1,200. The problem with this is that it doesn't explain what type of system this figure represents. Therefore, an empirical study was needed. Such studies have been undertaken recently in the US, looking at 44 dairy herds, and the Netherlands, which included 100 farms in their study, but nothing recently in the United Kingdom. Now, we're all very aware that heifer rearing is a big expense to the dairy enterprise, and monitoring costs is complicated because of the time lag between input and output. So the aims of this study were to record current rearing practices of dairy heifers in England, Scotland and Wales, so that accurate costs of rearing based on the data provided by the farmer and management practices specific to the farm could be calculated. And we also wanted to identify what farm factors had the biggest influence on the cost of rearing and how long it took individual farms to repay the cost of rearing and start making a profit for the farm. I personally visited 107 dairy farms throughout England, Scotland and Wales, and with 102 farms being included in the final analysis. A face-to-face interview with the farmers or the farm manager or the heifer rearer took place, during which time a comprehensive questionnaire, which the farmers can attest to, was completed, including the cost of farm inputs. Now, rearing was then divided into 3 development periods: birth to weaning, weaning to conception, and conception to calving. Statistical analysis was used to identify which farm factors had the greatest association with the cost of rearing, and a gross margin for each farm was calculated. I then developed a model in order to estimate at what point post-first calving the heifer repays their cost of rearing. So I'm going to discuss some of the results for the 3 development periods, then for the entire rearing period, followed by the output from the gross margin analysis and the model of the repayment period. So we start with birth to weaning. There was a large variation in the amount of milk fed to calves, with the average being approximately 4.5 litres a day. The cost also varied quite a lot, and this was due to different costs of production, farm gate prices and prices per tonne paid for milk replacer. Now, during the pre-weaning period, organic farms had a much higher cost of rearing, and there are several factors which have influenced this. Firstly, organic farms must feed milk for a minimum of 12 weeks, which can be twice as long as some conventional farms, and the per unit cost of milk fed on an organic farm is higher. Now, for any of the organic farmers who haven't passed out or had a heart attack after seeing these results, I would like to reassure you that this effect is no longer significant following weaning. So for the other 2 development periods, enterprise type, i.e. organic or conventional, doesn't actually influence cost of rearing statistically. In terms of contribution to the inputs of costs, we've got the feed, bedding and labour were the 3 highest, with feed accounting for 48.5% of costs during this period. From birth to weaning, spring calving herds had the lowest cost of rearing, as can be seen in this box plot graph. Now, for those of you who aren't particularly familiar with this type of graph, I'll just explain to you what the lines and the boxes actually refer to. So the line at the top is the maximum cost, the middle line is the median. Now the median is the figure is the 50% figure, so if you listed all the total costs in ascending order, the median would be the middle cost. It's not the average, it's the middle cost. And then the bottom line here is the minimum cost of rearing. This is actually correct. If any of you sitting there looking at this little outlier, this is actually correct. This is a farm that fed their calves ad libitum milk, which is why it's out there all on its own. The meaning of these figures here is we're comparing the 3 calving systems, autumn, multi-block and spring, to the baseline calving system, which is all year round calving. So in this period, only the cost of spring calving herds is actually significantly different from the cost of all year round calving herds, and this can be seen by the p-value, which is the probability that the difference is actually based on chance. So as a rule, a p-value less than 0.05 is considered significant, although this is actually an arbitrary figure. If we move on to weaning to conception, the average age at weaning in the study was approximately 9 weeks, ranging from 6 to 16 weeks, and the average age at conception was approximately 16.5 months, ranging from 14 to 23 months. The 3 largest costs in this period were again feed, labour and bedding, although reproductive management costs were not far behind the contribution of bedding. In this period, the cost of rearing for both spring and autumn calving herds were statistically different from that of all year round calving herds. However, there was a lot of variation in the cost of rearing in all year round calving herds, with several outliers. Now this graph here examines the relationship between the total cost of rearing from weaning to conception and the age at conception. Now R squared is the coefficient of determination, and what it does is it measures the amount of variation in the cost of rearing explained by the age at conception. So the output from this suggests that the age of conception explains 44% of the variation in the cost of rearing. And 509 days is the average age of conception in this study, and each little dot represents an individual farm from the study. The final development period is conception to calving, and the largest 3 contributors to cost in this period is feed, labour and waste management. Now the mean age at first calving in my study was 25.8 months, which is very similar to the NMR figure which was shown in the introduction slide. In this development period, the amount of time that heifers spend grazing has a big impact on cost of rearing. There is a linear association that suggests that the longer heifers spend at grass, the lower their cost of rearing from conception to calving. Now the number of days at grass explains approximately 44% of the variation in cost of rearing for this period. In terms of calving pattern, spring, autumn and multi-block calving herds were statistically different in terms of cost of rearing compared to all year round calving herds. However, once again, you can see there's a very large variation of costs for this period for all year round calving herds. So we're now going to look at the entire rearing period. Weaning to conception was the most expensive development period, and this is due to the fact that it is actually the longest of the 3 periods, with the average total cost of rearing being £1,819 and 1 penny. In terms of daily cost of rearing, the most expensive development period was from birth to weaning, which is not surprising considering the price per tonne of milk powder and the cost of production. The overall average daily cost of rearing was £2.31. So the biggest contributions to the overall cost of rearing were feed, labour and bedding, with total feed costs accounting for nearly 44% of total input costs. In terms of the contribution of the different development periods and also opportunity costs and capital costs, weaning to conception contributed the most to costs, which again can be explained by the fact that this is the longest development period. The age at first calving has a strong positive relationship with the total cost of rearing, which is approximately 35% of the variation in cost being explained by age at first calving. Now, the recommended age at first calving is 24 months, with the average age in this study being 25.7 months. If we look more closely at the effect of age at first calving in the next graph, if you take 26 months as a baseline, which is very close to what the average age at first calving was, and we make that 0, then reducing your age at first calving to 24 months will decrease your cost of rearing by 15.7%. However, if you have a first calving age of 27 months, the cost of rearing increases by 14.3%, and by 22.7% if you have an age at first calving of 29 months. Now, in terms of the amount of time spent at grass, because of the different ages that heifers are calved in this study, we can't look at the number of days at grass. We have to look at the percentage of the time of their rearing period that they spend at grass, because that way it becomes comparable. So percentage time spent at grass accounts for approximately 19% of the variation in costs, and costs tend to decrease with increasing percentage of time spent at grass. And in terms of calving pattern, the cost of rearing in spring and autumn calving herds is statistically different from the cost of rearing in all year round calving herds. But once again, the variation is very large in all year round calving herds, and there are a number of outliers. The next thing I did was I had a look at all the univariate analysis, and I picked out the factors that could be seen to be associated with the cost of rearing, and I did a multivariable analysis. So for those of you who aren't as up on your statistics as others, a multivariable analysis is a type of analysis used to examine associations between different factors. So in terms of this study, it was farm factors such as herd size, culling rate, location of the farm, etc. But it's taking into account the effect of other variables. So, for example, the time spent at grass is likely to be influenced by the type of calving pattern and breed, and vice versa. So in this study, the 5 variables that were identified as having the biggest effect on the cost of rearing was age at first calving, the percentage of the rearing period that they spent at grass, the calving pattern, breed, and herd size. And these account for approximately 62% of the variation in the cost of rearing. Now, for those of you who enjoy statistics, please feel free to examine the entire table. However, I am going to focus on this first column of figures, as this is the most important, and it elucidates how the different variables influence the cost of rearing. So the first variable is age at first calving, and what this £2.87 is it's saying for every extra day age at first calving, it's costing you another £2.87. Percentage time at grass, so if you increase your time spent at grass, you're going to decrease your cost of rearing by £6.06 for every percentage increase in time spent at grass. Now, the baseline, as you can see, for calving pattern, it's all year round. For breed, it's Holstein, and for herd size, it's 0 to 99 cows. So what you're doing is you're comparing the other groups within that particular variable to the baseline. So, for instance, if you're a multi-block calving herd, then you reduce your cost of rearing by £22.39 compared to a all-year-round calving herd. Now, breed was quite difficult because we have such a variety of sort of crossbred herds and sort of three-way crosses within our national herd. So Holstein cross and Friesian cross, for instance, if you have, say, a Holstein Montbéliard Scandinavian red, but the Holstein is the predominant breed, then that's a Holstein cross. If it's a Friesian cross, then it would be, say, a Friesian Jersey Scandinavian Red, but the Friesian was the predominant breed, then it would be classified as a Friesian cross. And then other purebreds were like an Ayrshire herd or a brown Swiss herd. And then herd size is self-explanatory. And I think it's quite interesting if you look at herd size, because as would be expected with increasing herd size would be economies of scale, and as herd size is increasing, you are reducing your cost of rearing at the same time. Now, when you look at the herds that are over 400, and that's gone a little bit squiffy, and I think that's probably because the number of really large herds was quite small within my sample of farms. So perhaps that would be slightly different if I had a large number of very large herds within the study. So just to give you an example of how you could possibly use this on farm, if you had, say for instance, you had an age at first calving of 730 days compared to an age at first calving of 821 days, which is a 24-month compared to a 27-month, the difference is about 260 pounds. And then say percentage of days spent at grass, a 40% compared to a 50% of the time spent at grass would make a difference of about 60 pounds. So if we say age at first calving of 26 months, we spend 45% of our time during the rearing period at grass. We're a multi-block calving herd, Holstein Friesian, and we have 275 cows. So that would give you a kind of rough estimate that your total cost of rearing would be about £1,630. Now, I know it only explains about 62% of the variability in cost, but it would give you a rough kind of ballpark to work out how much your total cost of rearing would be for your particular type of dairy production system. So if we move on to the gross margin analysis, the average gross margin per farm was £441.66, and there was a very large variation. Some things to consider when examining gross margins is that only variable costs are included in the analysis, and the cost of the output are very much dependent on the market value for the animals, which is obviously influenced by season, pedigree, breed, and the number of available animals on that particular day at market. The cost of mortality was based on average mortality rates from Jessica Cook's study, and these are also very variable, and they depend very much on the mortality rates on the farm and obviously the size of the herd, because smaller herds have fewer surviving heifers on which to apportion the cost of mortality to. The repayment period, which was trying to examine at which point farms are actually paying back their cost of rearing. So at the end of lactation 1, 23.6% of farms had paid back their cost of rearing, and by the end of lactation 2, 91% of farms had paid back their cost of rearing. The average number of days it took to repay back cost of rearing was 530 days, and that ranged from 168 to over 2,000. 530 days translates into about 1.5 lactations. So the repayment period is very much influenced by the cost of rearing and also the difference between the revenue from milk production and variable costs. And as can be seen in the table in the final column here, and we're just looking at mean or the average cost of rearing, and as you can see, as the average increases, so too does the lactation number during which sort of repayment actually takes place. So in conclusion, there was a large variation between farming systems in the cost of rearing. The age at conception and age at first calving were strongly associated with the cost of rearing, as was the amount of time that heifers spent at grass. And I'm going to leave you with sort of something to consider. So while the cost of milk is one of the highest input costs, weaning only accounts for 10.8% of the total cost of rearing. So increasing the amount of milk fed to calves may seem expensive at the time. However, overall it is not contributing much to the total cost of rearing and may indeed reduce total cost due to reduced mortality and morbidity better growth rates and earlier age at first calving.